And welcome, I'm Pip Tomson and you are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Joe Biden publicly pardons son Hunter Biden of his federal convictions in one of his final acts as US president. Syrian and Russian air forces strike back on opposition groups making claims on Aleppo. And the president of Georgia speaks out against the Georgian government following days of protests on the streets of Tbilisi. To the United States first, and US President Joe Biden is facing criticism after pardoning his son Hunter for tax violations and gun-related charges. Presidents often issue pardons before they leave office, but Biden had repeatedly said he was not planning to grant his son clemency, as Nick Harper reports from Washington.
There was this.
And I will not pardon him.
And this.
And have you ruled out a pardon for your son?
Yes.
And this from the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Is there any possibility that the president would end up pardoning his son?
No.
But now this. A full and unconditional pardon for Hunter Biden from his father, the US President Joe Biden. In a statement, Biden said his son had faced years of unrelenting attacks and selective prosecution, accusations Hunter Biden himself had railed against.
There is no fairness or decency in what these Republicans are doing. They have lied over and over about every aspect of my personal and professional life.
The pardon wipes away tax evasion charges Hunter Biden pleaded guilty to in September and overturns his conviction for buying a gun while he was addicted to drugs. He was due to be sentenced in both cases later this month. Incoming President Donald Trump has reacted angrily, calling the move an abuse and miscarriage of justice. And some lawmakers in the president's own party have labelled the decision wrong, saying they are disappointed. However, using presidential pardon to protect family and friends is not uncommon. Bill Clinton pardoned his half-brother for drugs charges, and Donald Trump granted clemency to associates and his daughter's father-in-law, Charles Kushner, the man Trump has now picked to be the next US ambassador to France. But President Biden is facing accusations of hypocrisy for breaking his own promise not to interfere in his son's legal proceedings. And the pardon also raises questions about the strength of the US justice system, which could be tested further when Donald Trump returns to the White House. President-elect Trump has hinted he could pardon hundreds of his supporters who were jailed for storming the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021. And he suggested he'll use the Justice Department to target political opponents. Biden says he hopes Americans will understand his decision. But it's a decision which could set a presidential precedent that sometimes some people are above the law. Nick Harper, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Let's talk about this a little bit more now with our correspondent Caroline Malone, who's in Washington. Hello to you, Caroline. President Biden, as we've been saying, repeatedly claimed he would not pardon his son. So what exactly has changed?
Well, it seems at this time that President Biden is well aware that he has just over a month left in office and he's clearly not running for president again. He has no political ambitions left for the first time in his life. And so therefore, he's chosen this time to completely pardon his son, Hunter Biden. It's not uncommon for presidents to pardon people that are close to them or even people that they think should be pardoned on more philosophical reasons. But Hunter Biden in particular is someone who has openly had a substance abuse problem. Over about 5 years, there were a number number of cases that were brought against him. This tax evasion and gun charges are among the most serious of them. And he could have faced something up to 25 years in prison, perhaps less, though, with the sentencing. And clearly, President Joe Biden has decided at this time, although he's said openly that he feels like they're unfair cases brought against his son because of bias, because they were trying to target him, because they were trying to quote, break his son, Hunter Biden. Clearly, he's decided that it's not fair, it's not justice. And even in the statement, he pointed out that he hopes people will understand because Hunter Biden is his son. Clearly, he's acted somewhat here because, his son is clearly a loved one to him. Donald Trump has obviously criticized this, many in his future administration, saying that there is, a hypocrisy here ultimately. President Biden saying up until just recently, and those in the White House as well, that his son, Hunter Biden, would not be pardoned, that no one is above the law. That was a sort of phrase we heard a lot during the campaigning, particularly earlier in 2024, when the Democrats were criticizing Donald Trump. And Donald Trump at that time had 4 huge cases against him, which whittled down eventually to just 1 case. But saying no one is above the law and then clearly acting completely in a contradiction to that by pardoning his own son is quite profound at this time. There's a lot of precedents for it, though, I should mention. Previous presidents, for instance, Bill Clinton, we heard there from Nick Harper, pardoned his own brother on drug charges. We know that President Obama as well actually provided pardons and leniency, so reducing sentences, for nearly 2,000 people during his 8 years in office. Those were mainly people who'd been charged on drug charges, on fraud charges, and also people that had been given sentences for abandoning and not contributing to the military campaign in the Vietnam War. So, in that case, I guess you could see it as being somewhat philosophical rather than for people to close to him, relatives or political benefits. Now, Trump, on the other hand, when he was in office, he did provide pardons to about 240 people. And that does include people that are close to him. That does include relatives. That does include potential political benefit, including, for instance, the father of his son-in-law, Charles Kushner. And Trump in recent days didn't just pardon him in his last time in office. He's now nominated Charles Kushner to be the next US ambassador to France. So clearly, acting in the interest of his family and those that he perceives to be loyal to him.
OK, Caroline Malone in Washington, thanks very much for talking to us. To the Middle East now, and Syrian and Russian forces are targeting opposition groups in the Aleppo countryside after the group claimed to have entered the city of Hama at the weekend. Syria's opposition-run rescue service, the White Helmets, say at least 25 people, including 10 children, have died in the strikes. Meanwhile, Iran-backed militia have entered Syria from Iraq to bolster the Syrian army. The Kremlin say Russia continues to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and the Turkish foreign minister has also pledged his allegiance. I can now speak to the conflict researcher and journalist Thomas van Linge. Thanks very much for talking to me, Thomas. Good to see you. The armed opposition group leading this new offensive is now moving towards Hama after taking Aleppo in recent days. Can you explain to us, and I think there's a map that you could possibly talk over, explain to us the significance of Hama and what the latest is there on that front?
Yeah, so after taking Aleppo, the second largest city in the country, Hama is basically the next big prize for the rebels on their road to Damascus. The highway from Aleppo to Damascus basically goes through first Hama and then the city of Homs. Rebels briefly managed to enter Hama on Saturday night before they were pushed out again by the regime. And now they're trying to do the same thing in Hama that they did in Aleppo. So first try to approach the city from the countryside, from different directions. And then once they see an opportunity to re-enter the city again and possibly re-establish control.
The Syrian army have bolstered their forces around and inside Hama. How successful has this been in terms of stalling the offensive launched by opposition armed groups? And will this help in any way to regain territory that's been lost in recent days?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is that both sides are still establishing their forces for the next round of fighting. We have to keep in mind that the rebels themselves are exceeding beyond all expectations. They never expect that they would take Aleppo in a day and that they could even be threatening Hama 3 or 4 days after their offensive started. So they had a bit of a strategic overreach where they suddenly could enter Hama unchallenged and then found that there were still regime forces there. So while both sides are now sort of scrambling to gather their forces for the next fight, we can see that the regime is calling on its allies, like the Russians and the Iranians and Iraqi militant groups, in order to reinforce the lines again. It should be noted that the chairman of the Hashd al-Shabi, the Iraqi Shia militias, has openly denied that his forces have re-entered Syria again to join the front lines. So if they are present in Syria, then they're not doing it openly yet. But if the reports are true that they are indeed in Syria, then that means for the rebels that it's now a race against the clock to take as much territory as they can before the regime forces can rally again, stabilize the front lines and think about a possible counteroffensive.
As you alluded to there, the Syrian government needs Russia and Iran's support, but both of those countries have been somewhat distracted, haven't they? So what kind of support can they actually provide? Will it be enough?
Well, it will be very limited, of course. I mean, Russia is forced to use all its resources in Ukraine to take small bits of territory one day at a time, and can't really be distracted now by any other theaters of war around the world. So their foothold in Syria has basically paid a price for that. The Iranians, on the other hand, have really suffered a lot of setbacks because of repeated Israeli airstrikes on their military positions. Even their embassy in Damascus got hit a couple months ago. So even though the Iranians are still present in Syria, their freedom of movement and their fighting capabilities have been severely limited by repeated Israeli attacks. So both those allies are now in a tough position where they would like to help the Assad regime, but can't really spare that much resources yet.
Thomas, are there any signs to indicate that opposition groups loyal to Turkey could be preparing to launch an offensive on territories held by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in places such as Manbij, for example?
Well, there was one video that came out just a couple hours ago of a number of Turkish-aligned opposition forces that stated that they would go to Manbij. So basically what we're seeing now is that everyone is scrambling their forces, their arms, and trying to take as much territory as they can. So, of course, the Turkish-aligned rebel forces will also try to see if they can take Manbij. I do expect that the Kurds won't surrender their territory as easily as the Assad regime had done. And if it turns out to be a costly battle, then at some point the Turkish-aligned rebels might decide to withdraw for the moment. So there will definitely be some clash between those sides, but whether we can see a sweeping rebel offensive against the Kurds is still very much a question.
Thomas van Linge, conflict researcher and journalist, really appreciate your analysis on Al Arabiya News this evening. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
To Georgia now, where there has been further unrest in the region with 4 consecutive nights of demonstrations. Thousands have taken to the streets in Tbilisi with fireworks aimed at police after the ruling party's decision to suspend talks on joining the European Union. The Prime Minister has rejected calls for new elections despite a string of resignations, including Georgia's ambassador to the US. We can go live to our reporter, William Denselow, who is in Brussels for us. Good to see you, William. All the signs are that this unrest is now spreading beyond the capital. What are the protesters saying?
That's absolutely right. You mentioned 4 nights of protests. On Saturday evening alone, it's estimated that more than 100,000 people took to the streets, essentially Many people that have been protesting are warning that their hopes of joining the European Union are essentially slipping away as Georgia moves away from the EU's orbit and towards Russia's orbit. Polling suggests that roughly 80% or so of the population is in favour of an EU accession. So many people see that their voices are not being represented. Many, of course, are incredibly unhappy with the outcome of October's parliamentary elections that saw a win for the ruling Georgia Dream Party. Many of these protesters, including the country's president, say that the elections were unfair and are demanding a recount. The EU itself has said that they're waiting for the results of an independent analysis of those elections as well.
Among the arrests, I understand, is the Georgian opposition leader. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, this comes at an incredibly heightened time of tension in Georgia. And especially with the fact that so many political leaders are so loudly speaking on both sides of the camp. The Georgia Dream, for example, have accused the opposition of lies. Georgia's president has said much the same on the other side of the debate. Of course, a huge proponent of joining the EU. And when it comes to elected officials here in Brussels, well, we've heard from Kaja Kallas, who's just been in the role as the EU's top diplomat, the foreign affairs chief, for just a couple of days now. She's come out and says that she regrets the signals from Georgian authorities not to pursue a path to the EU, also accusing the country of democratic backsliding. So touching on that point that you made about the concerns that the EU has about these protests, how they're being handled. Kaja Kallas also issuing a warning to Tbilisi, saying that what we've been seeing as a result of Georgia's Dream's action, she says, will have direct consequences. Pressed on that by journalists here at the European Commission about what those consequences might be. The press pool telling us that we'll have to wait to the European Council meeting a little later this month, where that issue of consequences will be very much up for discussion.
And just briefly, William, while I've got you, can we just talk about France? Because the French Prime Minister, he's facing a no confidence vote after apparently forcing through a budget.
That's absolutely right. Well, it's been since September that Michel Barnier has been in the role of Prime Minister. He's been in control of a minority government, so his position has certainly been precarious since the elections over the summer in France, to say the very least. He made the move to push forward the social security budget without going to Parliament for this vote, therefore triggering a no confidence vote that could come as early as Wednesday. Both the far right and far left have said they will like to go forward with that option. If Michel Barnier loses that no confidence vote, it'll be the first time since the 1960s that a Prime Minister has essentially lost his job as a result of a vote of no confidence.
William Denselow in Brussels, thank you. You're with W News. Time to have a look at the other stories making headlines around the world. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has pledged a further €650 million worth of military equipment to Ukraine. Scholz is in Kyiv today. It's the German leader's first visit to the Ukrainian capital in more than 2.5 years. Writing on X, Scholz said that Germany would remain Ukraine's strongest supporter in Europe. Romania's current governing party, the Social Democratic Party, looks set to keep its majority in parliament following the country's general election at the weekend. There was relief from centrist and left-leaning members after a far-right candidate, Călin Georgescu, appeared to claim victory in the first round last week. Elton John has revealed he's lost his eyesight whilst attending the gala performance of the stage adaptation of The Devil Wears Prada. Speaking in London, the global entertainer told the West End crowd he was unable to watch the show he wrote the music for, but enjoyed listening to it. The musician has been struggling with his eyesight ever since battling an infection last summer. The Australian actor Ian Smith, best known for playing Harold Bishop in Neighbours, has announced he's been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The 85-year-old, who first appeared on the soap in 1987, is suffering with a rare form of lung cancer. Neighbours has spawned the careers of many Hollywood A-listers like Margot Robbie, Russell Crowe and Guy Pearce. And brain rot has been picked as the Oxford Dictionary's 2024 Word of the Year. It was chosen after gaining 37,000 votes, and according to Oxford University Press, is the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, which can be a result of overconsumption of material considered to be trivial or unchallenging. Let's bring you a bit of business news. And thousands of workers at Volkswagen plants across Germany went on strike today, bringing assembly lines to a standstill. Thousands gathered at the car maker's headquarters in Wolfsburg, with demonstrations also taking place at the Hanover plant. The strikes, which could escalate if a deal is not struck soon, are likely to damage the car maker's plunging profits even further. Staying with motoring, and Vauxhall's parent company Stellantis has lost around €2.95 billion in value. It comes as the company's chief executive resigns, days after the car maker's factory in Luton was announced for closure. The firm, which also makes Jeep, Fiat and Peugeot, has lost around 40% of its share value this year, with most of the losses coming from the North American market. Moving on to sport, and McLaren have called for an investigation after their driver, Lando Norris, was penalised for ignoring yellow flags during the Qatar Grand Prix. McLaren say the severe decision lacked any proportion and affected Norris's finishing place ahead of the final race in Abu Dhabi this weekend. And Fiorentina midfielder Eduardo Bove is currently awake, alert and orientated in hospital after collapsing during a match against Inter Milan on Sunday. The match was suspended and later abandoned after the 22-year-old Italian footballer suddenly fell to the ground. He was later put into a medically induced coma. At least 56 people are feared dead after clashes broke out at a football match in southeast Guinea. It's believed violence erupted over a contested goal between Labi and Inzakori. An inquiry has been launched into the incident, while the Prime Minister, Uri Bar, has called the events tragic and offered his condolences. We can speak to our correspondent in Ghana, Nabil Ahmed. Nabil, hello to you. Tell us then, how did all this happen? Such a tragedy.
Well, two football teams in Guinea played a match on Sunday and in honor of the military leader Mamadou Doumbouya. Now, during the course of the game, the referee awarded a penalty to one of the football team, and they went ahead to score a goal, and that really infuriated the other opponents, and the football fans there decided to hurl stones on the pitch, and it resulted in clashes among the football fans. Now, the police who had stationed there in their quest to calm the situation decided to fire tear gas into the crowd, and then that actually escalated the whole chaos at the stadium and resulted in a stampede. And that is what's really resulted in dozens of deaths in Guinea over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking now at some of the pictures, completely chaotic there. Can you give us any more information about the number of people who've died and the number of those injured as well?
We are learning that at least 56 people have died as a result of the stampede that occurred on Sunday. at the stadium, and many others are also injured. We do not know the figure as yet, but we know that those who have died also include children, and some of them who are also injured are responding to treatment in hospitals in the country.
What have officials been saying in the aftermath of this, Nabil?
Well, on Monday, the officials have actually released a statement condemning the incident that happened at the stadium on Sunday. They've actually sent their condolences to the bereaved family, and they've assured them that they'll be investigating the circumstances that led to the deaths, and those who really are found culpable of really causing the whole stampede, they would be brought before the law to face justice.
Nabil Ahmed in Ghana, thank you very much for bringing us that update on W News. Let's bring you a reminder of our top stories. Joe Biden publicly pardons his son Hunter of his federal convictions in one of his final acts as US president. Syrian and Russian air forces strike back on opposition groups making claims on Aleppo. And the president of Georgia speaks out against the Georgian government after days of protests on the streets of Tbilisi. And that's just about it from me and the team here on W News. Thanks so much for joining us. Tom Burgess-Watson joins you next with GNT. From all of us here, a very good night.